"What are you doing here? Leave the premises immediately." The words cut through the sterile air of the hospital waiting room like a blade. Heads turned, the low murmur of conversation stilled, and all eyes shifted toward the tall, dark-skinned man standing at the reception desk. He wore plain clothes, a faded hoodie, jeans, and sneakers. Nothing about him screamed wealth, status, or power. What stood out instead was the way his hand pressed hard against his chest, his breath shallow, his jaw tight with pain. I need a doctor," he said, his voice strained. The nurse behind the desk, a woman in a starched white uniform, folded her arms. "We don't have time for people like you wasting resources. If you're looking for painkillers, try the free clinic downtown." "I'm not here for painkillers," he said firmly, though his voice trembled under the weight of his chest pain. "I can't breathe properly. I think something's wrong with my heart." A few people in the waiting area shifted uneasily, whispering to each other. One man muttered, "Drug seeker," under his breath. Another shook his head. The nurse smirked. "You look fine to me, standing tall, walking in here without trouble. You're just another faker trying to score medication." The man's nostrils flared, but he held himself steady. "Please, I need to see a doctor." As if on cue, a physician in a white coat stepped through the sliding doors into the lobby. He was middle-aged, with neatly combed hair and a stethoscope draped like a badge of authority around his neck. The nurse flagged him down eagerly. "Doctor," she said loudly, pointing toward the man. "We've got a simulator here. Says he's dying, but clearly he's just wasting our time." The doctor's eyes swept over the man with a glance so quick it was almost dismissive. He frowned. "You don't look like someone in cardiac distress. No sweating, no obvious pallor. You walked in just fine." "I'm telling you," the man said through clenched teeth, his chest rising sharply with each breath, "I feel like my heart is about to give out." The doctor chuckled, shaking his head. "And I feel like you've been practicing that line in front of a mirror. Listen, we don't treat liars or scammers here. You're not insured, are you?" The man stayed silent, his lips pressing into a hard line. The doctor smirked, turning to the nurse. "Exactly. He's here to get a free ride, nothing more." Then, raising his voice so the entire waiting room could hear, "This man is a fraud. He's pretending to be sick. Don't waste another second on him." A murmur spread through the room. Some people laughed softly. Others stared at the man with suspicion. One teenage boy even pulled out his phone, recording the confrontation. The man's eyes burned, but he kept his voice low, steady, almost dangerous. "You're wrong, and you'll regret this." The doctor waved a dismissive hand. "Save the theatrics for someone who cares. Security escort him out." Two orderlies stepped forward, their faces blank, their bodies tense. They gestured toward the exit, ready to remove him as if he were a trespasser. The man's chest heaved once more, his hand still clutching at his ribs. Slowly he turned toward the sliding doors, every step heavy, deliberate. His silence was louder than any protest. At the threshold, he paused. The nurse called after him, her voice sharp with sarcasm. "Try the clinic, sweetheart. Maybe they'll buy your little act." He didn't turn back. He simply stepped into the daylight outside, his figure swallowed by the brightness, leaving behind a waiting room buzzing with whispers and judgment. And then his voice, steady, controlled, filled the silence as narration. "They thought they knew who I was. They thought they could name me, dismiss me, erase me. But tomorrow their world will see the truth." The screen fades. The heartbeat monitor sound echoes faintly in the background, slow, heavy, ominous. The morning had started like any other sunlight spilling across the city streets. Commuters rushing toward buses, mothers pulling children by the hand. But for him, each step had been heavier than the last. There was a tightness in his chest, a weight pressing harder with every block. By the time he reached the hospital, his shirt clung to his back with sweat. Inside, the waiting room buzzed with the chaos of the day. Phones rang, babies cried. The hum of voices rose and fell like waves. Posters on the walls promised compassionate care for all. The words stung with irony even before the first interaction. He approached the reception desk, placing one hand firmly against his ribs. "Excuse me," he said, his voice quiet but urgent. "I need to see a doctor. It's my chest. The pain's not going away." The nurse behind the counter didn't look up right away. Her fingers tapped lazily on the keyboard, nails clicking with impatience. Finally, she raised her eyes, scanning him from head to toe in a single glance that felt like a verdict. "Insurance card?" she asked flatly. He shook his head. "I don't have it with me, but I need help. Please." The nurse sighed audibly, rolling her eyes just enough for the man behind him in line to notice. "Name?" she asked, already typing half-heartedly. He gave it, but she didn't repeat it back, didn't confirm spelling. She just entered it, muttering under her breath. "Date of birth?" he answered. "Address?" As he recited the details, her eyes kept flicking toward his clothes, the faint wear on his sneakers, the hoodie with frayed edges. She wasn't listening to the words. She was measuring him against an image in her mind of who belonged here and who didn't. "You'll need to wait," she said curtly, sliding a clipboard across the counter. "Fill this out." He glanced at the form, his vision blurring slightly as another wave of pain surged in his chest. He steadied himself against the counter. "Please, I don't think I can wait. It's serious." The nurse frowned, her lips thinning. "Everyone thinks their problem is serious. Sit down. You'll be called when it's your turn." Behind him, a woman in a designer coat stepped up. "I have a 10 a.m. appointment," she said crisply. The nurse's face transformed instantly, her voice lifting with warmth. "Of course, Mrs. Gallagher. Right this way. We'll have you in before you know it." The man turned slightly, his eyes narrowing. The contrast was brutal. He shuffled to a chair in the corner of the waiting room. Clutching the clipboard, he could barely hold steady. Around him, people whispered, some casting quick glances his way. One man muttered to his wife, "He's probably just here for meds. You can tell." The woman nodded, not even lowering her voice. "They always are." The man lowered his eyes to the form, gripping the pen tightly. His breathing came shallow, his focus slipping. He wrote slowly, each letter a battle against the pounding in his chest. When he finally returned the form to the desk, the nurse barely looked at it. She shoved it into a stack, already calling another name. Someone who had just arrived but wore a pressed suit and carried a leather briefcase. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice firmer now. "I've been waiting. The pain's getting worse." The nurse didn't even glance up. "You'll be called when it's your turn." He exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm. He could feel the heat of other eyes on him, some judgmental, some indifferent. To them, he was invisible or worse, suspect. A child coughed nearby. A man flipped through a magazine. Life in the waiting room went on as though nothing unusual was happening. But for him, every second felt like a countdown. He leaned back in the hard plastic chair, clutching his chest, his face tight with pain. In his head, a voice whispered the same cruel refrain he'd heard too many times before. "They don't believe you. They never do." But he wasn't going to leave. Not yet. The waiting room clock ticked loudly, each second dragging like an accusation. The man sat hunched forward, his hand pressed to his chest, his breaths uneven. Around him, the tide of indifference began to shift into something sharper. The nurse glanced up from her desk, her tone louder now, meant for everyone to hear. "Sir, if you're here looking for narcotics, you're wasting your time. We've seen this trick before." A ripple of murmurs passed through the room. A man 2 chairs away snorted, flipping a page of his magazine. "Figures," he muttered. "Always some guy trying to score." The man lifted his head, his jaw clenched. "I'm not here for that. I'm telling you, my chest hurts. I feel like something is wrong with my heart." The nurse leaned back in her chair, unimpressed. "Your color's fine. You're speaking clearly. You walked in here without help. People with real heart issues don't look like you." The words hung heavy in the air, sharp, dismissive, laced with prejudice. A woman in a fur-lined coat whispered to her husband, loud enough to be overheard. "It's always the same. They come in pretending, and the hospital just eats the cost." The husband nodded. Shouldn't even be allowed in without proof of insurance. The man's breathing quickened. Pain pulsed in his chest, hot and insistent. But the sting of their words cut even deeper. He forced himself to stay calm, to speak evenly. "Please, I'm asking for help." Isn't that what this place is for? The nurse scoffed. This place is for patients, not scammers, not people trying to play the system. A young intern passing through the waiting room slowed, frowning at the exchange. But when the nurse shot her a look, she lowered her head and hurried on. The man leaned heavier against the armrest of his chair, beads of sweat forming along his hairline. If you don't believe me, at least check. Run a test. Do your job. The nurse slammed her pen down. Don't tell me how to do my job. You people come in here making scenes, thinking you're entitled to everything. Her voice rose sharply, echoing across the room. I've got real patients to handle, not actors playing sick. The words you people landed like a slap. The teenage boy recording from his phone leaned closer, whispering to his friend, Yo, she's really going at him. They both snickered, the camera lens glinting faintly as it captured every second. The man's lips pressed into a hard line. He wanted to shout, to demand respect, but the pounding in his chest left him breathless. His silence, his restraint, only seemed to fuel their assumptions. The nurse turned away dismissively, her chair squeaking as she spun to face her computer screen. Next, she barked, calling up the next name. A man in a tailored suit rose immediately, striding past with his leather briefcase. The nurse greeted him with a smile, her tone softening into courtesy. Right this way, sir. We'll get you taken care of immediately. The contrast was brutal. The man in the hoodie sat in his chair, shoulders rising and falling, his dark eyes burning with quiet fury. The room buzzed again, the incident already turning into fodder for whispers and gossip. But inside, something shifted. The humiliation wasn't crushing him. It was crystallizing into resolve. They thought they knew him. They had no idea. The automatic doors to the emergency ward slid open with a hiss, and a doctor stepped into the waiting area. He was in his late 40s, tall, with neatly combed silver hair, and a stethoscope hanging around his neck like a badge of authority. His white coat was crisp, his expression severe, the kind of man who believed every step he took carried weight. The nurse perked up, waving him over eagerly. Doctor, we've got a problem. He followed her pointing finger to the man hunched in the corner chair, clutching his chest. The doctor's brow furrowed not with concern, but with irritation. What's wrong here? He asked, loud enough that the entire waiting room fell quiet. The nurse folded her arms, her lips curling into a smirk. He's claiming chest pain. Says he's dying, but look at him. Walking, talking, breathing just fine. No insurance card either. The doctor's eyes scanned the man briefly, a look so quick it felt more like dismissal than diagnosis. How long have you been sitting there? He demanded. The man forced himself to stand, swaying slightly from the effort. Almost an hour. I told her, I think something's wrong with my heart. The doctor chuckled, shaking his head. I think what's wrong is you've mistaken this hospital for charity. Real cardiac patients don't stroll in wearing hoodies and sneakers. They come in on stretchers, in ambulances. You? You look perfectly fine. Murmurs rippled through the waiting room. A few people nodded. Others exchanged knowing glances. The man's jaw tightened. I know my body. I'm not fine. I'm in pain. I need to be checked. The doctor's smile was thin, mocking. And I know mine. What you're doing is textbook malingering. Probably looking for pills, maybe a fake report for work. I don't play that game. The nurse laughed softly at his side. Told you. Total fraud. Someone in the waiting room snickered. A man whispered, Classic. Another muttered, Figures. The man's chest heaved, his breathing shallow. His voice trembled with controlled fury. You're supposed to help people. That's your oath. Isn't that what medicine is? The doctor leaned in closer, his tone dripping with disdain. My oath is to help patients. You, sir, are wasting my time. If you want attention, go somewhere else. Or better yet, stop pretending and get a job that comes with insurance. A gasps spread through the waiting room. A woman looked away, uncomfortable, while the teenage boy with the phone zoomed in, capturing every word. The man's fists clenched at his sides. His face remained calm, but his eyes burned. You're wrong, and you'll regret this. The doctor straightened, unfazed. I don't regret saving this hospital from liars and con men. Security escorted him out. Two orderlies approached, their footsteps echoing against the sterile tiles. The man didn't resist. He knew if he did, they'd twist it into proof of his guilt. Instead, he stood tall, even as his chest screamed with pain, and allowed them to guide him toward the sliding doors. At the threshold, he turned his head slightly, his voice low but resonant. The world doesn't end in this room. Tomorrow you'll see who I am, and you'll wish you had listened. The doors slid open with a mechanical sigh, spilling daylight into the waiting area. His silhouette lingered for a moment in the glow, before vanishing into the street beyond. The waiting room erupted into whispers, half mocking, half uneasy. The nurse smirked, the doctor shook his head, and the boy slipped his phone back into his pocket, grinning at the recording he'd captured. No one in that room could have guessed how right the man's words would prove. The emergency ward buzzed with activity stretchers rolling past, monitors beeping, nurses moving quickly between patients. Yet, in the break room tucked behind the main hallway, the atmosphere was disturbingly casual. The doctor leaned back in his chair, a paper cup of coffee in hand, his voice carrying the smug confidence of someone recounting a victory. "You should have seen him," he said, chuckling, clutching his chest like he was in some cheap drama. "I swear if I had $1 for every faker who tried that routine." The nurse from reception laughed along, shaking her head. "He didn't even flinch when I told him to leave. Just stood there like he was entitled to our time. And no insurance card, of course. Always the same story." Another staffer chimed in, smirking. "What did he expect walking in here dressed like that? Hoodie, sneakers? We can spot a scammer a mile away." Their laughter bounced around the small room, feeding on itself. It wasn't medicine being practiced here. It was arrogance being celebrated. But not everyone joined in. At the edge of the room sat a young intern, barely in her 20s, scribbling notes in a pad she hadn't been asked to keep. Her eyes flicked up from the page, unsettled by the laughter. She had seen the man too. She had seen the way his hand trembled against his chest, the beads of sweat forming on his forehead, the shallow rise and fall of his breathing. And now, hearing them dismiss him so easily, doubt gnawed at her. She cleared her throat softly. What if he really was sick? The laughter stopped for half a beat. The doctor turned to her, his smile fading into annoyance. He wasn't. I know what heart failure looks like, and he wasn't it. Trust me, I've been doing this longer than you've been alive. The intern shifted in her chair, shrinking under the weight of his stare. It's just, he looked like he was in pain. The nurse rolled her eyes. They always look like they're in pain. That's the act. Don't be so gullible. The doctor smirked again, sipping his coffee. One day you'll learn. Half this job is spotting who's real and who's faking. That man? Pure faker. The laughter resumed, though softer this time, as if even they sensed the cruelty in their own words. The intern stayed quiet, but her mind was racing. Something about the man's eyes, steady, calm, but burning with something deeper, wouldn't leave her thoughts. Later, as she walked through the corridor, she overheard two orderlies whispering. Did you see that guy they kicked out? One asked. Yeah, the other said. Didn't look like a faker to me. He could barely breathe. Don't say that too loud, the first warned. You'll get in trouble. The intern slowed her pace, her chest tightening. She wasn't the only one who had doubts, but in this place, doubt wasn't welcome. Conformity was. Meanwhile, the man they had thrown out stepped into the night air outside the hospital. The city lights blurred before his eyes as the pain in his chest pulsed harder. He leaned against a lamppost, steadying himself. For a long moment, he simply stood there, watching ambulances pull in and out, their sirens slicing through the air. His breathing was ragged, but his posture was tall, unbroken. Inside, they laughed at him. Outside, he carried a storm that none of them could see coming. The apartment was quiet when he entered, the hum of the city outside faint through the double-paned windows. He set his hoodie on the back of a chair and lowered himself onto the leather sofa, wincing as the ache in his chest flared again. For a moment, he closed his eyes, forcing his breathing to slow. On the coffee table sat an open laptop, its screen glowing with charts, projections, and financial models. A leather-bound notebook lay beside it, filled with handwritten notes, sketches of plans, and lists of names. This wasn't the living room of a man pretending to survive. This was the command center of someone quietly building an empire. He reached for a glass of water, sipping slowly, then opened the notebook. His handwriting was steady, deliberate. He flipped past pages of scribbled equations and market strategies until he found the one he wanted. Expansion plan. Q3. He underlined it twice, then added a note in the margin. Negotiate final deal by Friday. His phone buzzed. He answered, his voice steady despite the lingering pain. Yes? A polished voice came through the speaker. The investors are waiting on your decision. Are we moving forward? The man leaned back, his gaze fixed on the ceiling. We are, but only if the numbers make sense. Tell them I'll finalize tomorrow. There was a pause. Understood. And, sir, the magazine confirmed the interview. Tomorrow morning's edition. He exhaled slowly, a small, knowing smile touching his lips. Good. He ended the call, placing the phone gently on the table. For a long moment, he stared at the screen, where a draft headline from an email peeked out. Leaders of the future, visionaries who are changing the world. His name was bold in the subheading, but he didn't dwell on it. He closed the laptop and leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. His thoughts returned to the hospital. The nurse's mocking tone, the doctor's dismissive smirk, the whispers of the waiting room. Fraud. Scammer. Go somewhere else. Their words replayed like poison in his veins. He stood and crossed the room, pulling a framed photo from the shelf. It showed him years ago, much younger, standing outside a small shop with his late father. The shop's sign was faded, the paint peeling, but both of them wore proud smiles. His father's voice echoed in his memory. No matter how high you climb, they'll try to drag you down. But don't give them the power. Show them who you are through what you build. The man closed his eyes, gripping the frame tightly. The ache in his chest pulsed, but it was no longer just physical. It was something deeper, an ache born from every time he had been told he didn't belong, every time he had been judged by skin instead of merit. He set the frame down carefully, his expression hardening into resolve. Tomorrow wasn't just about an interview. It was about truth. He wasn't going to let their laughter define him. He wasn't going to let their prejudice dictate his worth. Tomorrow, the same people who had called him a liar would see his face in a place they couldn't ignore. And then they would understand. The fluorescent lights of the hospital corridor buzzed faintly, a cold hum that matched the tone of the staff gathered at the nurses' station. Papers shuffled, phones rang, and yet between their tasks, laughter slipped through like cracks in a dam. The nurse leaned against the counter, her arms folded, her voice pitched just high enough to carry. You should have seen the look on his face when security walked him out. Like a child caught stealing candy. The doctor smirked as he signed off on a chart. Chest pain, he mocked, pressing a hand to his own chest in an exaggerated pantomime. He was walking better than half the people in this building. A faker, plain and simple. One orderly chuckled. Yeah, you were right to throw him out. No insurance, no real symptoms, just another scammer trying his luck. The words floated easily, casually, as though mocking a man in pain was part of the day's routine. But not everyone was laughing. At the far end of the waiting room, the teenage boy who had filmed the incident sat hunched over his phone. His thumb hovered over the post button, his heart pounding faster than he'd expected. He'd replayed the clip 3 times, the man's calm but pained voice insisting he needed help, the nurse's sarcasm, the doctor's dismissal, the words, "You people." Something about it didn't sit right. He whispered to his friend, "Man, should I put this up?" His friend shrugged. "Do it. People love this stuff. It'll go viral." The boy hesitated another moment, then tapped the screen. Within seconds, the clip was live. Title: Guy gets thrown out of ER for faking chest pain. The friend laughed. Perfect. It's going to blow up. But as the boy watched the first comments trickle in, his smirk faded. That doesn't look fake at all. Why is the nurse talking to him like that? This is messed up. He could have died. The likes came fast, but so did the outrage. Back at the nurse's station, the staff remained oblivious. The nurse recounted the scene again, her voice smug. He even said, "You'll regret this," like some movie villain. Can you imagine? The doctor chuckled. Well, if he's dead serious, I'll look for his name in the obituaries tomorrow. The staff burst into another round of laughter, but just beyond the sliding glass doors, a paramedic walking past overheard the words. His face tightened. He knew enough about chest pain to realize that dismissing it so casually was reckless. He shook his head, muttering under his breath, "One day, that attitude's gonna kill someone." Inside, the intern who had spoken up earlier scribbled in her notebook, her jaw tight. She wanted to speak again, to challenge them, but the atmosphere was suffocating. Here, hierarchy mattered more than truth. She swallowed her words, her conscience twisting like a knife. Meanwhile, across town, the man they had mocked sat at his desk, reviewing financial documents. He was oblivious to the fact that his face had already begun circling the internet, not as a titan of industry, but as the man unjustly thrown out of a hospital lobby. The video gained traction quickly. By the time the nurse poured herself another coffee, hundreds of strangers had already seen it. Some laughed, some raged, some shared it further, adding captions, "Discrimination in plain sight." The storm was building. None of the people laughing in the hospital realized that by morning, the storm would have a name. The city outside glowed against the night sky, a river of headlights threading through darkened streets. In a high-rise apartment, the man sat at his desk, the soft light of a lamp illuminating stacks of papers, open laptops, and sleek binders filled with contracts. The pain in his chest had dulled but hadn't disappeared. Every time it pulsed, he was reminded of the hospital, of the smirks and the dismissive voices that still echoed in his mind. But here, surrounded by evidence of the life he had built, the memory burned differently, not as humiliation, but as fuel. He pulled a crisp folder closer, opening it to reveal spreadsheets and projections. His pen moved across the page with precision, adjusting numbers, circling figures, underlining notes. At the top of the sheet was a logo, Vanguard Horizons Group. The world outside the boardrooms didn't know the name, but anyone with money did. It was his creation, his empire. His phone buzzed on the desk. He answered immediately. "Sir," came the voice of his assistant, smooth and efficient. "The Forbes interview is confirmed for tomorrow morning. They'll send a photographer as well. They want to highlight you as the face of innovation for their cover story." The man leaned back in his chair, his face unreadable. "Good. Has the press release gone out?" "Yes. The embargo lifts at 8 a.m. sharp. By then, every business outlet in the country will have your name in print." He paused, staring at the city lights outside. "Let it happen. I want them to see." "Sir?" "Nothing," he said quietly. "I'll be ready." He ended the call and set the phone down. For a long moment, he just sat there, fingers steepled, his breathing slow, his gaze hard. On the bookshelf nearby sat a row of magazines. Fortune, Inc., The Economist. One was turned face out, last year's Forbes issue. Its cover headline read, "The Billionaire Builders." Inside, his name had been listed among the top rising entrepreneurs to watch. But tomorrow, his face wouldn't be hidden in an article. Tomorrow, it would be the cover. He rose from the desk and crossed to the window, looking down at the streets far below. People bustled in tiny streams, anonymous in the night. He thought of the waiting room, how quickly strangers had judged him, how confidently the nurse had dismissed him, how easily the doctor had branded him a fraud. They hadn't seen a man fighting pain. They had seen only what they wanted to see. He whispered into the glass, his reflection staring back at him. "They think I'm invisible. Tomorrow, I'll be everywhere." The clock on the wall ticked past midnight. He closed the folder, stacked the papers neatly, and placed the pen carefully on top. His preparations were complete. As he switched off the lamp, the room fell into shadow, save for the glow of the city beyond. He stood there a moment longer, calm now. The storm inside him settled into a sharp, controlled focus. Tomorrow the mask would drop. And when it did, the people who had laughed would find themselves staring at the very man they had thrown away this time, on newsstands across the nation. The hospital cafeteria buzzed with its usual morning chaos. Trays clattered, coffee machines hissed, and the smell of burnt toast lingered in the air. Nurses in scrubs huddled around tables. Doctors skimmed charts between sips of coffee, and orderlies wolfed down quick breakfast before their shifts. On one table by the window sat a small stack of newspapers and magazines, delivered before dawn like always. The top one was fresh, glossy, still carrying the faint scent of ink. It was Forbes. A young nurse reached for it absent-mindedly, flipping the cover into view, and froze. "Wait, no way," she whispered. The others looked up. The glossy page showed a portrait of the man they had mocked and thrown out just a day before. He was no longer in a hoodie and sneakers. In the photo, he wore a sharp suit, his gaze direct, confident, unshakable. The headline above him read, "The Visionaries, Leaders Reshaping the Future." And there was his name, printed bold across the bottom, one of the most influential business figures of the year. Forks clattered onto trays, a cup of coffee tipped, spilling brown liquid across the table. "That's him," the nurse whispered again, her voice trembling. "That's the man from yesterday." Across the cafeteria, a group of residents had gathered around their phones. The video of the incident had already gone viral overnight. Now, paired with the Forbes cover, it was impossible to ignore. On one screen, the man's voice echoed through tinny speakers. "Please, I need help. Something's wrong with my heart." Then the doctor's reply, "You're a fraud. Go somewhere else." The video cut straight to the magazine cover, posted side by outraged strangers online. The comments scrolled faster than anyone could read. "Unbelievable. They denied care to a billionaire. This is racism in broad daylight. Fire that doctor. Fire them all." The cafeteria erupted into whispers. Some staff went pale, others shook their heads in disbelief. The receptionist nurse from yesterday walked in, yawning, only to be met with silence. Dozens of eyes turned toward her, and then toward the magazine lying open on the table. Her face drained of color. "No," she whispered, barely audible. "That can't be." But it was. Moments later, the doctor entered, adjusting his coat, his expression smug as always, until he saw the frozen room. His eyes followed their stares to the magazine cover. His hand paused mid-motion, the color leaving his face. "That's," he began, but the words caught in his throat. The cafeteria was silent, save for the rustle of pages as someone flipped the magazine open. Inside was a full spread-in interview, photographs of the man in boardrooms, shaking hands with world leaders, standing before skyscrapers that bore his company's name. There was no doubt. The faker they had humiliated was not only real, but a man whose influence reached far beyond the sterile walls of their hospital. The doctor's mouth opened again, but no words came. The nurse backed toward the door, her hands trembling. Around them, the murmurs grew louder, angrier, sharper. "Isn't that the same guy they kicked out?" They called him a scammer. Imagine if he had died out there. The truth was undeniable now. The man they had dismissed as worthless was on the cover of the most prestigious business magazine in the world, and the world was watching. By mid-morning, the hospital's name was everywhere. Hashtags trended across Twitter and Instagram. Forbes man denied care, racism in healthcare. He told you so. The video had been reposted by celebrities, politicians, and activists. News anchors debated it live, their faces solemn as they replayed the now infamous clip. The man, "Please, I need a doctor, my chest." The nurse, "Go somewhere else, stop faking." The doctor, "You're a fraud, you don't belong here." Cut to the Forbes cover, gleaming under studio lights, his confident eyes staring back. The narrative wrote itself. A billionaire entrepreneur humiliated, mocked, and thrown out of a hospital because of the color of his skin. Inside the hospital, panic spread faster than any infection. Administrators huddled in glass offices, their voices sharp, their faces pale. Phones rang constantly, reporters demanding comments, board members demanding answers. The doctor who had dismissed the man sat in a small conference room, His arms crossed tightly, his jaw clenched. He looked less like the confident authority figure of yesterday and more like a man cornered. "I didn't know who he was," he muttered. "That's the problem," an administrator snapped. "You shouldn't have needed to know." The nurse sat beside him, her hands trembling. "We thought he was faking. He didn't look—" "Didn't look?" The administrator cut her off, her voice icy. "Didn't look like what? Like someone worth treating?" The silence was suffocating. Another administrator paced the room, holding up the magazine. "Do you understand what this is? This is Forbes. He's on the cover. Do you have any idea what kind of damage this does to us?" The doctor's face reddened. "It wasn't about race. I made a medical judgment." But even as he said it, his voice wavered. He could hear his own words from the video, replayed endlessly online. "You people!" There was no defense for that. Outside the room, the intern lingered in the hallway, listening, her notebook clutched tightly in her hands. She remembered the man's eyes, the sincerity in his voice, the way his body had strained with pain. She had doubted yesterday, but now her doubt had hardened into certainty. He had been telling the truth. Further down the corridor, staff whispered in clusters. Some defended the doctor. He was just doing his job. Others shook their heads, appalled. No, he humiliated that man. And now, the whole world knows it. In the waiting room, patients scrolled on their phones, gasping as they saw the cover, the headline, the articles piling up online. One man muttered, "That's him. I was here yesterday. I saw it happen." His voice carried, sparking a ripple of outrage among those around him. The hospital's pristine image cracked in real time. Meanwhile, across town, the man himself sat in a studio, the Forbes photographer adjusting lights around him. He wore a perfectly tailored suit, calm and composed as the shutter clicked. The interviewer smiled, her voice respectful. "You've built something extraordinary. Tell me, what drives you?" He didn't answer right away. His mind flickered back to the nurse's smirk, the doctor's dismissive tone, the laughter in the waiting room. Then he turned back to the camera, his voice measured. "What drives me?" he said slowly, proving that no one has the right to decide who belongs and who doesn't. Back at the hospital, the doctor buried his face in his hands. The nurse stared at the floor. The administrators whispered about suspensions, firings, lawsuits, and the world kept watching, waiting to see what the man would do next. The hospital lobby had never been so tense. By late morning, reporters crowded outside, cameras flashing at every door. Security guards stood stiff at their posts, holding back the tide of journalists demanding statements. Patients shuffled uneasily through the crowd, some pausing to snap photos of the chaos. And then the lobby doors opened and silence fell like a curtain. The man stepped inside. No hoodie, no sneakers this time. He wore a tailored navy suit, a crisp white shirt, and polished shoes that clicked sharply against the tile. The sunlight from the glass entrance framed him, making him look larger than life, untouchable. Every head in the waiting room turned. Gasps rippled through the crowd as whispers spread. "That's him, the Forbes guy. He's back, the one they threw out yesterday." The receptionist nurse froze behind the desk. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, trembling. The doctor, summoned hastily to the lobby, stood stiffly by the wall, his face pale. He tried to muster the confidence he always wore like armor, but his lips betrayed him, twitching with unease. The man walked slowly, each step deliberate. He stopped at the reception desk, looking directly at the nurse who had told him to go somewhere else. "Good morning," he said evenly. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried like thunder through the silent room. The nurse swallowed hard. "Sir, I didn't realize that I was a person worth treating?" He finished for her, his tone razor sharp. Her eyes filled with tears. She shook her head weakly, unable to respond. The man turned, his gaze sweeping the room until it landed on the doctor. "And you," he said. The doctor stiffened, trying to recover some dignity. "Sir, my judgment was based on prejudice." The man cut him off. His voice rose, firm but controlled. "You didn't see a patient. You saw a stereotype. You didn't hear my words. You heard only what you wanted to hear. And then, you humiliated me in front of strangers." The waiting room was silent except for the faint hum of the overhead lights. Some patients nodded, murmuring in agreement. Others pulled out their phones, recording. The doctor raised his chin, though his voice faltered. I didn't know who you were. The man's eyes burned. That's the point. You shouldn't have needed to know. His words cut through the air, heavy and undeniable. The nurse lowered her gaze, ashamed. The doctor opened his mouth to defend himself again, but the murmurs of the waiting room drowned him out. He's right. They treated him like trash. Unbelievable. The hospital administrator hurried into the lobby, her face tight with forced calm. Sir, she said carefully, we'd like to apologize on behalf of the institution. This is not who we are. The man turned his gaze on her, unblinking. It's exactly who you are, and the world has already seen it. The administrator faltered, her voice catching. The cameras outside flashed through the glass doors, their lights spilling across the polished floor like fire. The man stood tall, his silence louder than their apologies. Finally, he spoke, his tone steady and final. Change must begin here, or this hospital will not survive the truth. He turned to leave, his polished shoes echoing against the tiles. The nurse collapsed into her chair, shaking. The doctor's face was red with humiliation. The administrator whispered frantic orders to staff as the crowd outside erupted, reporters shouting questions. But the man didn't look back. He had already said everything they needed to hear. The press conference hall was packed. Rows of cameras lined the back wall, their red recording lights glowing like watchful eyes. Reporters filled every seat, pens poised, microphones angled forward, the air thick with anticipation. At the podium stood the man they had mocked only a day before. His suit was sharp, his posture unshakable. But it was the fire in his eyes that commanded the room. Behind him, projected on a screen, was the Forbes cover his face, staring out confidently beneath the headline, The Visionaries. He adjusted the microphone, the murmurs in the room falling instantly silent. Yesterday, he began, his voice calm but steady. I walked into a hospital with chest pain. I asked for help. I was mocked, dismissed, and thrown out. Not because I lacked symptoms, not because I was disruptive, but because of what they saw when they looked at me, a black man in plain clothes. The crowd shifted, pens scratching, cameras clicking. They called me a faker, a fraud, a man wasting their time. They told me to go somewhere else. His jaw tightened. But what if I had collapsed on that sidewalk? What if my pain had been the warning of something fatal? Would they have cared then? Or would they have written me off as just another statistic? A hush blanketed the room. He leaned closer to the microphone, his voice firm. What happened to me isn't rare. It happens every day in hospitals across this country. People judge not by their symptoms, but by their skin, by their clothes, by assumptions that have nothing to do with medicine. He let the words settle, his gaze sweeping across the room, pinning each reporter in place. And this time, he continued, it happened to someone the world recognizes. That's why you're all here. That's why it made headlines. But understand this. I am not the only one. There are thousands of others, ordinary men, women, and children, who never make the cover of Forbes, whose stories end in silence. The reporters murmured, the weight of his words pressing down like a storm. He straightened, his tone sharper now. Healthcare should not be a privilege reserved for those who look the part. Compassion is not something to be rationed. A man in a hoodie deserves the same care as a man in a three-piece suit. If we can't agree on that, then we've lost our humanity. Applause broke out, hesitant at first, then swelling until it filled the hall. Some reporters stood clapping, while others wiped their eyes discreetly. The man raised a hand, quieting the room again. This is not just about me. It's about every person who has been told their pain is imaginary, their lives less valuable. Today I call for accountability, for reform, for a system that remembers its purpose, to heal, not to judge. His voice dropped lower, resonant, final. Because yesterday, I was treated as invisible. But today, the world sees me, and through me, it sees the truth. The room erupted once more. flashes exploding from cameras, questions shouted over one another. But the man didn't waver. He stepped back from the podium, his presence commanding even in silence. The image of him standing before the Forbes cover would spread across headlines worldwide before the day was over. And with it, the story that no hospital administrator could bury. The city was quiet that evening. The storm of cameras and flashing lights had faded, the reporters gone, their stories already racing across the world. The man sat alone in his penthouse office, the skyline glowing behind him, the streets below flickering with the endless pulse of headlights. On the desk in front of him lay the magazine. His face stared back from the glossy cover, his name bold beneath the headline. He ran his hand across it slowly, not with pride, but with a deep, thoughtful heaviness. He remembered the nurse's dismissive smirk, the doctor's cold eyes, the laughter that had echoed in the waiting room, as if his pain were a punchline. He remembered the way his chest had ached, not just from illness, but from the weight of humiliation. And he remembered walking out, promising quietly, "Tomorrow, you'll see who I am." Tomorrow had come, and the world had seen. But as he leaned back in his chair, staring at the city lights, he whispered to himself, "This was never about proving who I am. It was about proving who they are." He stood and walked to the window, his reflection meeting his gaze in the glass. To the world, he was a billionaire, a visionary, a man on the cover of Forbes. But beneath the titles, beneath the suits and accolades, he was still the same man who had walked into that hospital in a hoodie and jeans, still human, still vulnerable, still deserving of dignity. He thought of the countless others who didn't have his platform, his wealth, his influence, people who were turned away, unseen, unheard, people whose stories would never reach headlines. For them, he realized, this wasn't just a scandal. It was a matter of survival. His phone buzzed on the desk. Messages from leaders, activists, and journalists poured in. Offers to collaborate on reform, invitations to speak, promises of support. The world wanted him to lead. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He simply picked up the phone and began making calls. "Yes," he said firmly into the receiver. "We start tomorrow, no delays." Because this wasn't just a victory. It was a beginning. The camera of imagination pulled back through the glass window, across the glittering skyline, over the hospital that still loomed in the distance. Its halls were quieter now, but the echoes of shame lingered within. His voice, calm and steady, closed the story like a verdict. "They called me a fraud, a faker, someone unworthy of care. But what they didn't understand is simple. Respect isn't earned by wealth or power or recognition. Respect is owed to every human being, regardless of what they look like, or what they wear, or what they own. Yesterday, they denied me dignity. Today, they reminded the world why it must never be denied again." The frame faded to black. On screen, the words appeared, "Luxury fades, wealth fades, power fades, but dignity must remain." Then silence.